Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for joining. I know this is your last course, and afterwards you will be taking test. Good luck with your test. I don't want to last for the lecture to last too long, but I understand you're master degree students, so I assume you have not written 100 papers. So I'm going through some of the basics of journal writing and submission from an editor's point of view. So journal obviously has many sections. You always want to start with the title page. The title page generally includes a very succinct title. And the journal, most of the journal do not allow abbreviations, with some very few exceptions. For example, ECG, electrocardiogram, that might be useful in the title, but most of the journal want you to write out the title. Now, the importance of the title, in addition to convey the concept of your study, is that the title words or words in the title are used for by the search engines to search. So if you have a title that includes certain nouns or certain things in the title, those are the first thing to be searched. This is true for many years and continues now. So if you want your paper to be searched by people, then you should include important words in the title. On the right side is a paper that published in March from this institution in hard rhythm. The title is Significance of Manifest Localized Staining During Ethanol Infusion into the Vein of Marshall. Vein of Marshall is something that recently people have been searching for. So if you type Vein of Marshall, you want your paper to be seen. And ethanol infusion is a method that is increasing its popularity. So if you put in methanol and Vein of Marshall, chances are you're going to see one of these papers. So there are other important search terms. Staining, for example, although in histology, staining is using antibody staining. This is staining in cardiac cath lab is to indicate that you have dye coming out of the blood vessel. So instead of the dye inside the blood vessel, it stains the surrounding myocardium. So that can be used for search term as well. So when you structure a title to make it short, to convey what you have done, and to include important words in the title. Now, the other important portion of the paper is the abstract. So here is an abstract of the paper. Different journal has different style. In many journals, especially in cardiology, there are background, objective, methods, results, or conclusion. There are also in circulation, for example, it doesn't have objective, it just has background, method, results, and conclusion. You want to follow journal style, you have to respect the word limit. Currently, during the first submission, the staffs do not perform detailed quality analysis of the paper. So if you have an abstract, chances are it's going to be going to pass through for the first review. However, it is good to respect the journal word limit. For hard rhythm is 250, I believe for circulation is 350. So you want to look into the instruction to authors and see how many it is. Number 3, I want to emphasize is the abstract has to be easy to understand. The reason is abstracts are most read. This abstract is not only in the paper, but also posted in PubMed, which everybody uses to search for the paper and to read the content of the paper. If you don't have access to a particular journal, for example, hard rhythm is not a gold open access journal, then you will have to go through your institutional library in order to read the paper. A lot of people don't want to do that. They just want to read the abstract and know what it is. By the way, since I have this opportunity talking about the access to the journal, there are 2 types of journals. recently there is a plan started in Europe, mandates that all the publicly funded work should be published in Gold Open Access Journal. The Gold Open Access is that the entire journal is available online free of charge. There are some journals in Heart Rhythm Society, such as Heart Rhythm O2, Heart Rhythm Case Reports, Heart Rhythm Digital Health. These are Gold Open Access Journal. The author actually pay for publication. The cost of the publication in Gold Open Access Journal varies. It could be $1,000 or $2,000. It could be $500. This really depends on the type of the journal, the length of the article, and so forth. So, but the good thing about the Gold Open Access Journal is that once you publish in that journal, your entire paper is easily available to everybody. Other journals, including many major society journals, like Heart Rhythm, they are not Gold Open Access. You can pay for Gold Open Access by paying a fee. For example, in Heart Rhythm, if you have $3,600 US, you can pay for your paper to be published with open access. But the journal itself is not gold. So part of the journal are open access because the sponsor or the authors have paid for the open access fee. Other journals don't have open access. That's the difference. There's a growing trend that the European Union is going to request that you publish only in Gold Open Access Journal, and you want to look for those journals to submit your paper if you are funded by the public funds, and that is a requirement. And finally, you want to avoid non-standard abbreviations in the abstract. That's very easy. That's very important because in a lot of instances, the people only read the conclusion. So this conclusion says in our study, localized staining was frequent, but not associated with clinically relevant impact or disadvantages. So then the authors who are not in this field can move on to the next paper because they got what is important conclusion in the study. So conclusion has to be carefully written. There are some bad conclusions you don't want to do, and I hope, as from my editor's point of view, I hope the reviewer don't do. Let's just come up with a fake conclusion. So AF ablation increases the levels of GETs and the CATs. A lot of people doing this and more than two abbreviations in the conclusion. Now that frustrates the readers because in order to know what are GETs, what are CATs, you have to go back and look the body of abstract and for the definition. And sometimes the definition itself even was poorly written. So this kind of conclusion should be avoided. You always want to spell it out. So just for most of the readers who read your conclusion only, they read your title, they go to your conclusion in the PubMed, and they move to the next paper. And in only a minority of paper, people actually go through the trouble of downloading the article and read the article itself. The ratio of that may be hundreds to one. So I want you to consider writing a really good conclusion in your abstract, and that one is going to be posted in the PubMed. Now, there are also people trying to insert some unnecessary sentences into the conclusion, such as future studies are needed to determine if they are clinically important. Now, you don't need to do a study in order to conclude future studies are needed. You can write anything, and you can always conclude future studies are needed because the future studies are always needed to further investigate a certain phenomenon discovery. And if I see this, I try to convince the authors to use this sentence for some better describe the methods of conclusion of the study, methods or results of the study, rather than include this kind of prolonged sentences, useless sentences as a conclusion statement. Now, the next section of the journal is keywords. The keywords Depends on different journal. They have different requirements. For high rhythm journal, we ask for 5 to 10 keywords. Use American spelling and avoid the general and plural terms, multiple concepts. For example, you want to avoid, for example, and, of, and so forth. So keywords basically are the nouns. Only abbreviations firmly established in the field may be eligible. So do not use gets, mets, whatever it's those kind of terms in the keywords, but ECG might be appropriate. You want to use the keywords that's already mentioned in the text. Otherwise, the page editor will find you during the proof stage to ask you to change your keywords. The reason is that if you write a paper about one thing and you never mentioned certain nouns in the keywords, for example, you did the optical mapping studies, you never mentioned the word genetics in your study, it is not good to include genetics in the text. The reason to include genetics as the keyword. The reason that these keywords will be used for indexing purposes. So when you search for the paper, the search engine look for keyword, the title, what kind of words are in the title, but they also look in what kind of title words in the keyword. And if the genetics shows up, it will prompt people to look for genetics in your paper. But the word genetics has never been mentioned, then that keyword is very misleading. Another thing for the student to understand the importance of the keywords is that keywords may be used to match the paper with reviewers. This is things that a lot of authors do not know. So you think the keyword just for your own benefit, so in the future the paper can be searched. Not true. Because when you submit a paper to a journal, such as Harvard, we have 1,500, 1,600, or sometimes 2,000 submissions a year. Now, we have a group of board members, reviewers, and so forth, searching, working for the journal. So when the paper come in, how do you find the reviewers? So generally, the reviewers submit a list of keywords to the journal, and then editors use the keywords as a criteria to select which reviewer is going to review the paper. So I will come to that keyword a little bit later. So I would just want to emphasize the importance of the title words and the keywords, because many years later, when people want to look for for something related to your field, they type in the nouns, and those nouns in the title and in the keywords tend to come up. There's another thing I want to mention, that if you have proper keywords, you have proper nouns in the title, which one shows up on the first page of the Google Scholar? And that really depends on how often your paper it has been cited. So the Google Scholar search, there are people have done analysis, is that in addition to the keywords in the title and the keywords in the keyword list, and how often it was mentioned in the paper, but also how important the journal is and what time it's published. So those are multiple factors. Just like you do a search, you like to be shown on the first page. Now, at this point, when editor receive a paper, the first thing editor would read is the letter to the cover letter. So in the cover letter, you will describe whether or not this paper is relevant to Harvard and why it is important. So very brief, but most importantly, there are journals want you specifically to say that this paper has not been submitted and is not being considered for publication elsewhere in any language. And so you want to look for instructions to authors to make sure those are in your cover letter. After I read the cover letter, next I will read the abstract. So with the abstract, I decide whether or not the paper is focused on heart rhythm. For me, for example, if somebody submit a paper on ECG changes during myocardial ischemia, but no heart rhythm is involved, and that paper, chances are I'm going to death reject. So if you submit something about liver to circulation, for example, that liver thing has to be relevant to the heart and or circulation. You don't want just to do a ischemia paper in heart rhythm. So that's obvious. Currently, a lot of societies have case report journals, including heart rhythm society. So if you have a single case reports, unless it's really unique, that will not be considered. Case reports will be unique if you report first in man therapy. For example, you report the first WPW surgical ablation. Those are very important case reports. Or you report the first 3 cases of esophageal perforation. And those are important case reports you may submit to a better journal. And for most case reports, interesting cases that you observe, it goes to a case report journal. People has to be careful of a writing paper to include IRB and IACC approval in the first paragraph of the method section. You don't want the editor to look deep into the method section to see that you have IRB and IACC approval. If you do a clinical trial, you have to say your clinical trial registration has been completed. And what is the trial number? There is at least one paper that after the paper was reviewed first time, the reviewer said you haven't done clinical trial registration, and the author attempted to do retroactive registration. It's that trials are completed, but then they register for the trial, and that is not allowed. There are several prominent weak methodology that I like to discuss, so that you can avoid to do this if at all possible. So you may go out and look for medical records, for example, from your institution, and retrospectively look at certain genetic mutations and what is the clinical findings and so forth. If you do retrospective study, the strength of the evidence is less than a prospective study. So retrospective study is generally considered a weaker methodology, although in some cases, those papers are acceptable. The things that's generally not acceptable is using retrospective chart review to compare 2 groups. So for example, you have available to you 2 different chemical reagent in the lab that does the same thing. And one day you choose to use one, the other day you choose to use the other one, based on whatever you prefer that day. And at the end of the study, several hundreds are used, you retrospectively look at the results of these 2 reagents and show they are no different. That is not or they are different. That is not a very good study, because you have selection bias to go into it. This is the same for clinical trials, clinical studies. So one caster is better than the other caster, or not different than the other caster. Generally, these papers are very poorly reviewed because of the selection bias going into the study and make the results less conclusive. There are people doing very poor manuscript preparation. You have to follow the instruction. So those are important. Finally, quality of figure in the tables are extremely important. I cannot overemphasize that, because if you take care to do the quality figure and tables, it will be good for the readers, and the editor would more likely to publish your paper if you use better graphics, colors, and so forth. So the next thing I want to emphasize is after abstract, you would go into section of introduction. Now, there are people writing lengthy introductions. For reviewer and for readers, that is not a very good thing. If the introduction goes on and without the focus, the reviewer doesn't go into the next section. So this was this tip was given to me by my mentor when I was writing my first few papers, and I want you to make sure you remember that the title page should be brief. I generally, if it's double spaced, this is my paper. If it's double spaced, I keep it within the first page. So the nerve structure, whatever, and at the end you would say the purpose of the present study. So you don't have to give people results. You don't have to give people detailed methods. You don't have to do a discussion in the introduction. All you have to say is what is the problem, what problem I want to solve, what is the gap of knowledge, what the gap of knowledge I want to solve. If people want to know more, please read the method and results section and the discussion. I'll tell you why those are important studies. If your introduction goes on and on for 3 pages, it's very disturbing. Okay, so keep your introduction short and to the point is important. And there are also reviewers insist that the important papers should be cited in the introduction. For example, this whole paper is about the frequency content of the nerve activity. And there are many previous publications about the frequency content of nerve activity itself, of blood pressure monitoring, of heart rate. They all have some frequency spectrum, very similar. And you want to cite those papers upfront to tell people that you are knowledgeable about the literature, what has been published in the past, and what you want to do. After that, citing the background, you want to say, where's the gap of knowledge? There are some gap of the knowledge. For example, in the previous study, the nerve activity has really not been measured from the skin. They are measured elsewhere. It's not prolonged, and so forth. So now we have a method of this recording. Then what is our purpose to study? You don't want to go do any too much more than that. And this is enough just to make sure the readers are interested in your study and continue to read on. Now, methods, I generally recommend subheadings. So you have done a dog study. You want to describe your surgical procedures. The first sentence, or at least in the first paragraph, you want to say animal protocols approved by the Institutional Animal Care Committee of whatever university. And it's good to add the sentence conform to the guidance the care use of laboratory animals. Some reviewers say you need to, or editor wants you to cite, then you cite. That's an unlatched publication. Otherwise, this is a common statement. Just make sure that you have IRB approval of the study. What is your clinical trial registration? Put it up front. Then, how the surgery was done, what was implanted to the dog, and so forth. Then you go on with your data analysis, and you want to include as a separate statistical method section to describe the statistics. Currently, a lot of journal hire statistical editor. So generally, the flow of the review is that your paper got reviewed by 2 experts in the field about, for example, nerve activity. And they come back, they say, okay, these are okay, but you use a lot of complex statistics. And on revision, the editor will then invite a 3rd reviewer who is expert in biostatistics. The reason is that the biostatistical reviewer is difficult to find. If you want to review for a journal, you say you want to review for genetics and so forth. So they say we'll have plenty of reviewers. But if you say you volunteer to review for statistics and you happen to have a PhD training and with statistical training and so forth, the editor welcome you to join the reviewing process, because good statistical editor or reviewer are difficult to find. Personally, I have a paper was stuck in one of the prominent journals for 2 months because the editor could not find a statistical reviewer to respond. So that is a issue that you have to think about. So if you do if you do complex statistics, it will be good to invite a statistician to be one of your collaborators, especially for you to do clinical studies or complex genetic analysis. Result section the same. You want a subheading. You want generally you want to give specific examples, and then don't forget to give a general description. So if you've done, for example, over here 6 dogs, you have 1 dog that really shows the phenomenon. You want to have a paper, have a figure, describe what phenomena describe. But then you have to have a paragraph saying, in addition to this typical dog, there are additional 5 dogs. So here's for all dog studies, the mean, the standard deviation, what is the p-value, and so forth. So that's important to support the conclusion paper. Otherwise, you wasted all your dog studies. You just do 1 dog and then report a case report. So in this case, you want both specific examples and general descriptions. And especially if it's a brand new phenomenon that nobody have seen before, not familiar, you want to describe the phenomenon first. Then you want to describe that among all the experiments done with the same methods, how often that phenomenon is present. And if you have 2 groups comparison, you can then do your comparison just to strengthen the conclusion of the study whenever possible. Then the next section is generally discussion the reference. I would prefer for you to briefly summarize the main findings in the first paragraph. So when people look into the discussion, first paragraph said, I have found that gravity is important for the apple to fall to the ground. And that's very new, very interesting back then. And people would then look at your discussion, see what is going on. So subheadings are suggested. And I would think something related to the mechanism would always be important, even if you are writing clinical papers, but especially important for basic science papers. So in clinical papers, you would want to discuss why these observations come about. So for Bordeaux, for example, Dr. Hazagaris, a famous paper, 1998 paper on ablating pulmonary vein to terminate atrial fibrillation. And he has described the phenomena in the results section. It's very new. Nobody ever knows. It's obviously clinically important. But then on the mechanisms, he has to say, why is the pulmonary vein so important? What is in the literature? And what we suppose that pulmonary vein ablation is curative for atrial fibrillation. And people are interested in knowing what do you also think. If you say you do not know, that's okay as well, as long as really there has not been nothing in the literature this was so new. That's basically what Dr. Hazagaris said, that the mechanism is not really clear. But then subsequent, these are very important discussions, and people can do a lot of study in the pulmonary vein and try to figure out. It turned out the pulmonary vein has muscle fibers that have very short action potential and is prone to trigger the activity induced by calcium transients. So none of these are known until Dr. Hazagaris has demonstrated the importance of pulmonary vein, and people can start to study pulmonary vein. But you have to mention your paper about the mechanism, your major findings. Clinical implication portion is important for basic science. That is, you have to have something people say blue sky. That is, you have done your study, you have find the things, the molecule, whatever. What it might be useful to humans. And this is something you might consider to add. And don't forget that at the limitation session, the paper without limitations are often not reviewed well by the reviewer. Is that the implications that you think you have perfect methodology and there is no limitations on your control, but there are always limitations. Your number is small. If you study Purkinje fibers, your isolation has some problems, whatever you do a clinical study, your limitations, this is not a prospective study. Just has to be honest about it. And in some journals, such as Harvard, they want you to include a conclusion statement. This conclusion statement does not have to be exactly the same word by word as conclusion in the abstract, but has to match. But over here, you are less limited by the wording limitations of the abstract. So you can extend the conclusion a little more. So that's generally, hopefully by this time, the reader will then go into the conclusion, remember what you have said in the paper, and they will remember to quote you about your conclusion. So you find this important thing, I'm doing the next thing that's important to me. So that's a conclusion. Finally, the reference. You want to always try to use journal style, and I strongly encourage you use EndNote. I discovered there are still people who don't use EndNote to write the papers, and that is not a good practice. The journal style can be entered into the EndNote, and the EndNote can you can edit each individual journal style, and you format the same font as the main text. You don't want your reference to be a different text font as the paper, so that looks awful. So that's the reference. You want to look at the journal instructions. Their journal has limitations on number of references. References are always included in the total word count, and almost all journals have word count limit. So if the word count limit is 5,000 and you include 100 references, you very quickly run out of space for your own results. So don't be too generous in referencing other people's papers, just those important and essential papers included in the reference. Reference, however, is there's something I want to also tell you, that the ability to reference the most important papers is also important to the reviewer. There are many papers about certain subjects. So one good practice is you look at Google Scholars, you search Google Scholar. As I said, they search for title words, keywords, and also how popular the paper is, how often the paper has been cited. And you want to use the reference that is more often cited by other scientists. These are the important source of information by consensus. And if you include those references, you will be more supportive of the fact that you are familiar with the literature. If you go to other search places such as PubMed, you just pull out the wording, but without knowing how often it's referenced. Those papers are often published on obscure journals, and they are often not the first observation or the most important observation published. So that's why many people use look at the reference, which reference you cite, and if you omit important references, the reviewer may complain. And that is one mechanism, one reason why some of the reference kept on adding to each other. I mentioned Dr. Michelle Hasgara's AF ablation reference. That's been cited thousands of times, because if you want to support a statement about the pulmonary vein ablation is important for atrial fibrillation treatment, that's a reference you go back to. You can also cite many hundreds of thousands of publications afterwards, but people would think giving Dr. Hasegara some credit is very important. That shows your respect whoever made the first discovery. So reference is not a minor thing. As you go through your scientific career, you will find the citations become important both for your own journal and when you review somebody else's papers. Don't forget to remove the track changes in the first submission. That's actually a common mistake, because when we, this is the recent work I'm doing, will be published January 1 on the state of the journal, during which many like continue to make changes, but the important, you want to remove those track changes. However, there is one important thing. Now, when the paper comes back for you to do the revision, make sure you use track change mode, because some of the journals, many journals request you submit two versions of the paper, the Word files during resubmission. One version is a clean version that is go to printer. The other version is a version that includes all your changes. For example, you have a reviewer's comment showing that you should tell them how many times this particular paper has been downloaded. So you made changes. You want to tell the reviewer where the changes are, and you want to show them this is actually a change I've done. I'm not secretly doing the changes that you have not reviewed. So otherwise, people kept on changing things inside. The reviewer has to read the entire paper in order to give you a comment. With track change mode, the reviewer only needs to read where your changes are. That saves them a lot of time. And for editors, a big benefit, because the reviewer can come back faster. In many journals, they want to prepare a paper to show line numbers. Line number can be shown in by selecting layout. Okay, once you select layout, you will see a line number option. You click on the line number, you can select either you number the lines from 0 to 1,000 or whatever in your paper continuously, such as in this case, or you can number the first line, line 1 on each page. Don't forget to insert the page number and the line number. The reason is that when reviewer review your paper, they like to refer to line number 38, that you have something that I want you to change. So it's easier for reviewer to say line 38, and you just go back to your original paper and see line 38. I know exactly what the reviewer says. And if you don't have that line, the reviewer has to count 1, 2, 3, line 3, paragraph 1, page 5. It's very annoying. Okay, so I would recommend line numbers. I don't think any journal prohibits it, but if they do, of course, don't include it. But Harvard specifically requested, although some authors just ignore it. The other thing is about the figure and the figure legend. When you publish a figure, you want to make sure the first sentence of the figure is a title. It's like you're doing a scientific presentation. On top of the slide, there is always an opportunity for you to enter a title. So all figures should come with a title. So left lateral vagal nerve stimulation and nerve activity in the left stellate ganglion. So that's the title of this figure. And number 2, it's very important to look at your figure and look at the font size. So in this particular figure, the font size is acceptable. So you can publish this figure in a cross page or just in half the column. You can still see the numbers. So if you have very, very tiny little numbers inside that people can see, you may as well delete it. Okay, you don't want to publish things that people cannot see. So that's very important to you. And if you have your original work that the machine come out with some numbers and it's too small to be seen, you want to delete them or do something to it and add your own number, make the number clearly visible to them. And finally, when you make figures, try to use colors. In the very old days, when the journal are all print and black and white, we discourage using colors. The reason when you put into the copier, when it come out, it become gray. And you can tell the shades of the gray from one to the other after it goes through the copying machine. So the quality of the figure reduced. However, currently everybody uses PDF. So the color is really helpful, and nobody runs the paper going through the printer, the fax machine, and so forth anymore. So using colors, and make sure you have your best foot forward when you have a pathological slides. Actually, for pathology, if you have a pathology collaborator, ask them to take a picture. No matter how you try in your career, you will never be able to take a pathology picture better than the pathologist, because that's their trade. That's what they are for. So a good picture is always very helpful for your paper get published, showing the quality of this paper. Then I want to talk about the supplemental materials. Supplemental materials is generally used to overcome the word limit in print journals. So some journals like Heart Rhythm has a word limit of 5,000. And that 5,000 includes everything, but your method section is very long. So you can put some detailed methods on the website for supplemental material, and also you can include videos. But please do not include important results. Sometimes the reviewer would come back and say, figure X in the supplemental material should be in the main text. So you should look at the figure that's important in supporting your conclusion. Those figures should not be put in supplemental material. You should always squeeze into the text. The supplemental material are not page set. So in other words, it did not go through editorial process in the publishing house. And they are not printed. They are online only. So the supplemental material you have to submit, preferably in a PDF, and your color can be seen, and people can look at your PDF. In some journals, they allow you to submit the Word files as well. But just remember, this is the final product. This is what your readers are going to see. There is no next processing to make it look good. So it's not page set. So when you publish a paper with supplemental material, you want to make sure your supplemental material is neat, is nice, and is quotable. There is no limits on words, figure, and table, and so forth. But please remember, some reviewers decline to review extensive supplemental materials. I know this for a fact. Some people publish a paper in Nature. That's obviously very brief. Then they put in a supplemental material counted like 20 figures and 30,000 words. This really increases the reviewer's burden. Sometimes you just have to do it, but the other times it's important to be considerate. Some of the reviewers just plainly tell editors, I decline to review. It's too long. So I want to tell you a little bit about what happens to your paper once submitted. The most important thing, obviously, is the reviewer selection. So it's a mystery how the editor selects the reviewers. So I can tell you that mystery. Reviewers' expertise and reputation obviously weighs heavily on the editor's mind. They want you to be reviewed by somebody who is expert, but it's not always possible. So among the reviewer pool, there will be keyword match. So this is what I just told you, that keywords are very important. For example, you enter a keyword of a common keyword, atrial fibrillation. Well, when editor click that keyword, the system generate maybe 500 reviewers capable of reviewing atrial fibrillation. So you also want somebody who is interested in your paper specifically on Brugada syndrome. So if you have a paper on atrial fibrillation in patients with Brugada syndrome, you can add another keyword on Brugada syndrome. Then there are two matches. Very few reviewer wants to review both atrial fibrillation and Brugada syndrome. Those has expertise on both would enter those keywords for the editor to search. So sort of important for you to enter the keyword. That's one way you can influence. You can potentially influence who will be reviewing a paper. The things you cannot influence, however, is the reviewer availability. If the reviewer just reviewed the one paper for you in a journal in the past months, generally the system will bypass him. So even you ask the editor to assign suggest certain reviewer, it may not be possible because that reviewer may be on vacation. You can include reviewers you oppose, but if you are on a very small field, you always oppose somebody and there are just a few experts around, then that increase the difficulties of the editor. But generally, from editor's point of view, I think most editors probably share my impressions that you rarely have an enemy in your field. You don't want them to review. You can include those as opposed reviewer that's opposed by the authors. So how do I make a decision? Well, decision obviously inputs from reviewers. Then the paper is generally reviewed by the next layer of editors, associate editors, section editors, and they actually serve as a third reviewer, although those editors do not necessarily enter their opinions in the decision letter. And that comes to editor-in-chief, then I generally follow their priority setting. The paper, without saying, novelty is important. You want to find something new. Hot topic, for example, recently there are COVID. So in 2020, when people submit a paper about COVID, it has never been published before, it's likely to be accepted. The New England Journal of Medicine published a whole lot of those. People argue that it's not up to the New England Journal of Medicine standard. However, it's important hot topic. The editor choose it, and they are cited and used very importantly. So it's important. Controversial fields and so forth. But this generally determined by your mentor at the beginning of your project. It's very hard to alter at the time of paper writing. Then what happens to your paper afterwards is once your paper finally is accepted, it will be published in some journals 3 to 5 business days. This is early access. The paper then transmitted to a journal office to publisher, which will within a week, where the publisher will then upload the paper to NIH website immediately. So this actually become the first version of the papers available to public. Remember, NIH then processes a published paper in 1 year for open access. This is a public PMC publication. This actually is the second version of your paper. You don't have a chance to do a revision. You just showed up on the NIH website and freely available to others. This is for American authors with NIH funding. So make sure your final version of paper are carefully proofread, because that become publicly available even before the journal is printed. Okay, I cannot emphasize that enough. Now, page editor will then work through the paper and generate proof, also receive proof, or also submit proof and respond to queries. Page editor then finalize paper. These are stock pages ready to print. The journal office draft the table of content and send to editor-in-chief for final approval. Approval table content is sent to publisher to print. And 6 weeks later, the print journal and mail to the authors. The PDF is published online. Now, PDF will be the lead version of the journal, not the print. The PDF will be the most authentic version of the journal. So proof has to be careful, but you have to remember this is actually the third version of the paper that's available to publish to the readers. The third version may be slightly different than second version because on the NIH website, because the second version may be slightly different than it's based on the first version. So it's important you don't have any major issues on the first version of submission. Otherwise, you want to change during the proof process. Those changes are not working to some of the other versions, since NIH cannot use people's proprietary page set versions for publication. They can only manage your first version for publication. So the whole process has to be very carefully done. Okay, you can appeal to the editor. I generally don't do that. If you write the email to editorial office, editor will review the reviewer's comments, provide all their feedback. Outcomes mostly there's no action. Rescind decision, you have to clearly indicate the reviewer clearly made an error. For example, you have done a prospective study, clearly indicating your methods, but reviewer somehow thought you have done a retrospective study, therefore the importance evidence is not strong. And you can make that argument and the paper chances are will be re-reviewed. But very rarely does there's a need for appeal because you can always go to the next journal. Briefly on letters to editor, these are limited to comment on recently published paper only, and the author get to respond. That listed, those letters are listed in PubMed. But don't submit a letter, just complain that author failed to cite your previous paper. That never works. Trying to be an uninvited reviewer is not working. Trying to write an uninvited editorial, that doesn't work either. Finally, there's a category of research letter. This is a relatively recent phenomenon, 800 word limit plus 1 figure and table and 5 references. No supplements allowed. They are used for focus report and including PubMed. And when you put that research letter on your CV, it looks like a peer-reviewed paper, and it's actually peer-reviewed. A good, most downloaded paper from Harvard actually was a letter. The letter editor about life-threatening therapy inhibition foam containing magnet. So that's the letter. And when your iPhone put on the device suspended. So if you have one single thing you want to show with one figure, this is one approach you could do. And if you want to go to Google Scholar and search for foams and magnet, it turned out to be the first paper. It could be very visible. So if you have one small thing to say without extensive thing, you could go to that. Plagiarism, we will skip. It's very hard to determine plagiarism. But if some other author complain you plagiarize, then that's a major issue. There are calculation impact factor recent change. As you know, impact factor is a publication of 2016, 2015 add together as a denominator, and how often these papers are cited in the subsequent year, 2017, and that's the impact factor of Nature. But just recently, changing journal impact factor rules creates playing fields for some. So what does that mean is that recently, the paper has this early access. So you can publish paper this year and then print the paper next year. And during this time, your paper can be cited. And the longer it takes, the more citation it accumulates, but it counts as paper for the next year. So the new impact factor calculation for this year is citation plus early access in 2007 divided by publication 2016, 2015. This will increase this number. So on the right side, you can see in some journals, all of a sudden the impact factor shoots up. And that is something that is going to be a phenomenon in these 2 years, okay? So the impact factor is going to fluctuate in many journals. The journal has to pay back next year when these formulas kept on changing for the next 2 years.